Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation by the American Iris Society. Please support the organization by becoming a member. Go to irises.org and click on Join. Thank you.
Um, First of all, somebody asked me what a family was in plant families. Essentially, plants are divided into two main groups, the monocots and dicots. And probably most of you have heard of monocots or dicots. What they really refer to is the seed leaves when the seed is germinating. Dicots have two seedlings and monocots have one. But the big difference is that the dicots, when they sprout, their growing tip is at the top of the stem. So you have these two little leaves, and then you have a growing tip just above that, and then it produces more leaves and so on. And the growing tips are always at the top. Whereas in the monocots, the growing tip stays down in the seed and produces a leaf that comes up and grows out, and you're getting the end of the leaf all the time above ground, not the growing point, which means that grazing animals and stuff can come along and chomp it off and it still can survive, whereas a dicot is going to get zapped. It's handy to know because that's why people that have mowed their lawns for hundreds of years tend to have very few uh, plants that are growing in them that aren't grass, because grass is a monocot and a lot of the weeds are dicots. So the growing tips get mowed off and the dicots don't survive. So those are the two main groups. They can also be told apart by the fact that the monocots have parallel venation in their leaves. And the monocot, excuse me, the dicots have something like a palmate venation or interlaced venation that branches and so forth, uh, not like the parallel of the monocots. So Iridaceae is a family, and the Iridaceae and a lot of other plant families are clustered in orders, which are which make up the different classes. So we have class monocot, dicot. Then we've got a whole bunch of orders, and all the orders end their names in ALES, ALES. So the iris, it was interesting because when I was doing research on this talk, I went back to 1990, and there was a paper by Peter Goldblatt, who's probably the world's most knowledgeable person on the iris family. And he was describing the family, and he noted that the Iridaceae were in the order Liliales. Well, in 34 years, they're now in the order Aspergales, which came to be quite a shock. And at the time in 1990, there were only 1,600 species known, and now there's over 2,000. So the changes are constantly occurring in taxonomy, and we're learning more and more all the time. Back in 1990, there were 66 genera in the Iridaceae. Excuse me, there were 77 genera in the Iridaceae, and now there's only 66 because they've decided that some of these genera didn't really need to be separated, that there were actually more one genus than being split into two. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to give you a heads up on where the family is changing constantly. All the families end in ACEAE, ACE. So Iridaceae, Liliaceae, Asparagaceae, um, Rosaceae. But you know, you're talking about family when you're talking about AC. And essentially, all these different classes indicate that at one point there was one living organism that originated everything from that. So the iris family, there must have been one prototype iris that generated the entire family through evolution. Um, so that's basically what families are about. How do you tell the Iridaceae from a whole bunch of other monocots? Well, for one thing, it has what's called as an inferior ovary, which means the flower parts, the petals and the sepals, which in Iridaceae are called tepals. We don't refer to petals anymore. We call them tepals because we can't. There's two series of three tepals, and they're united in a tube at their base, and they go down and attach to the ovary at the bottom, which is below the tepals. In other plant families, the ovary is superior and sits above the attachment of the petals or tepals or whatever you want to call them. So that's a big difference. And also in the Iridaceae, those two series of three, we think of standards and falls and iris, but we don't call them that in the other genera. They're attached together at their base into a tube. So you have this floral tube and then the two series of tepals, 3 and 3. In case of iris, it's standards and falls and standards, or standards and falls, however you want to look at it. Those are things that distinguish the Iridaceae. And then there's one key feature that's really sort of neat that makes it easy, is all Iridaceae had 3 stamens. That's the male parts, you think where the pollen is. Okay. Iridaceae only have 3. So if you're looking at a crocus, for example, or you're looking at a colchicum, which looks exactly like a crocus, how do you tell in the fall? There's crocus that bloom in the fall, and there's colchicums that bloom in the fall. They look almost identical. How do you tell them apart that one's a crocus and not in the Iridaceae, and one's a colchicum and not? Colchicums have 6 stamens. So the number of floral parts is a big deal. And in taxonomy, we go back to Linnaeus, and we think of Linnaeus as being the father of taxonomy, and that's sort of where it all starts. And he talked about the binomial system of nomenclature, and that's what we give him credit for. But his system of organization was popular not because of the binomial system. The binomial system, what it did was it had a genus and a species, 2 words that signified every plant. Before that, they used maybe 10 words sometimes to describe a plant. So it was real complicated when you wanted to talk about something, you had a whole bunch of words you had to put together to talk about a particular plant, whereas Linnaeus only had 2. So his system was nice, and that's what we give him credit for. But the reason why it caught on, the dirty little secret, is it was all about sex. Linnaeus counted the sex parts in the flower. So Iridaceae had 3 stamens, so it was called triandra. Okay, 3 anthers. In Victorian times, they didn't talk much about sex. So when he came out with his system, it was like scandalous. But of course, that's why it caught on, and everybody was using it because of the sexual part. And if you think about it, it worked better than any other system, because what is evolution based upon but reproduction? And to have reproduction, you have to have sex, usually, or often. So there's asexual reproduction too. But anyway, so that's why we have this whole system, this how it works. And now you know pretty much how you distinguish an iris or iris family. One of the other traits that isn't quite as obvious is the sword-like leaves. A lot of irises have sword-like leaves, but it's really the way they're put together with the stem, so that they sort of wrap around the stem. And all the other irises, even some that don't have sword-like leaves but have other types of leaves, still have that sort of way of coming out around the stem and then branching off, with the leaf and wrapping around the stem at the beginning. So that characteristic is another characteristic of the Iridaceae. Okay, let's go on to now you know what the family's all about. I want to put in a disclaimer here because everybody gets hung up on punctuation or pronunciation. And I don't know why, but it seems like everybody wants to play a gotcha with pronunciation, when really, according to one of the top biologists in the world, is Peter Raven, and in his botany book, he said, botanical Latin is not a spoken language. And I've been to a number of conferences with taxonomists of all different sorts. And when you get them all together and hear them talking, there's probably 20 different pronunciations for every name that comes out there. So you're never really wrong when you pronounce something different than somebody else, as long as you don't put in extra syllables that don't exist, or letters or something. But as long as it has all the basic parts in the word, then it's right. But there are some standards that are generally agreed on. For example, in Latin, every vowel is pronounced. Hence, we don't have, we have cotoneaster, not cotton Easter, because the E and the A are both pronounced. And a second rule is that the penultimate syllable is what's emphasized. And that means that it should be, that's the penultimate is the third one from the end. So cotoneaster should be the pronunciation. And probably we don't do it reliably that way. Cotoneaster is a little easier to say than cotoneaster. Cotonia, I can't even do it. Cotoneaster, cottoneaster, cottoneaster. But anyway, my major professor in taxonomy used to always say, you put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. But and I've gotten in the habit of doing that, because if you're not talking with people about these names, you don't get used to saying them properly. And when you're looking at them on a page and thinking about the parts that they're made up of what they mean, then you wind up emphasizing the different parts differently with your emphasis than the way it should be. So like Nemastylus and Nemastylus. Nemastylus would be correct, but Nema and stylus are the two functional Latin words that were brought together to make the name. So anyway, don't be afraid of pronunciation. Be forewarned that I'm probably going to mispronounce a lot of things, even though I'll try to give you the right pronunciation. The family is a big family, obviously, next only to orchids. And there's 7 subfamilies. The first 5 are really primitive and very unusual plants. And some of them were actually divided off into their own families at one time or another. And there's only, as they say, there's only 66 genera. And I'm going to try to show you a little bit of almost every one of them. So we're going to have to go fairly quickly through the different genera, but nonetheless, I wanted to give you an idea of what's there. Next slide. We'll start with isophysis, isophysis. Okay, comes from Tasmania. It's the most primitive of all the Iridaceae. And if you look at the diagram on the right, you can see the ovary sticks up actually above, just the opposite of what I just told you about the Iridaceae, above the attachment of the petals. This is the only iris in the family that has a superior ovary. And there's only one species. And superior ovaries were considered more primitive than the inferior ovary of the rest of the family. So this is the most primitive plant in the iris family, isophysis. isophysis. I'll get it right. Anyway, so it's a very small little plant. Probably nobody's going to bother growing it, but it is really interesting. You can say the name on the thing changed from Huardia to isophysis some years ago. But anyway, let's go to the next slide and we'll see some more. That was the first subfamily. The second subfamily has 21 subspecies. That's quite a few. And it's from Australia, Borneo, Sumatra, and New Guinea. And it has 3 petals, and they tend to be have a second series that's minimized to just a bristle or just a small, tiny little petal that's hardly apparent. And I'll show you in the next slide. But just notice the plants. This is what some of them look like. They're all pretty much alike. Let's go to the next slide. And you can see on the white one to the left, the petals, or I shouldn't say petals, the tepals, the inner tepals, which would be standards, are practically nothing at the bottom of the base of the larger outer tepals. So this gives you an idea of this plant. Notice the plant, the whole plant. In this group, there's some woody growth. So if you think about a woody iris or a tree iris, these hardly get to be trees. They're very tiny bushes, but it has a little bit of wood. And so woodiness is considered a primitive trait. And so that's why this group with the genus Pattersonii Pattersonia is very primitive and separated from all the others. And it might be fun to grow. It's sort of tiny flowers, if you can see the fingers on the right, but it's interesting. Next slide. Now, not only do we have these other plants, but we also have saprophytes, which means they live off of the roots or dying roots or dead material of other plants, and they don't produce any leaves. So there's one genus with 3 species, some say 2 species, Geoceras, yep. By the way, iris, the I in Latin is always pronounced E, so it really should be Geoceras, and iris should be iris. And if you think nobody calls iris iris, then if you attend a botanical conference in Rome, like I did, everybody was saying iris, and it was very hard on the ear to try to get used to it. But nonetheless, that's the correct pronunciation. And as Americans, we don't do that very much. So you're going to get sort of an American, semi-American botanical version of the different names. But this is an oddity, and it's considered very primitive. But growing as a saprophyte is something that is sort of an advanced trait anyway. Next slide. So these 4 subfamilies at the beginning have very few plants in them. This is one of the larger ones, the Aristioideae, and the Oideae is a standard ending for all subfamilies. So you know you're talking about a subfamily if it's Oideae. Aristea is not too showy, but it is some of them, like Aristea capitata. I've grown that, and it's a fairly pleasing plant, but not particularly spectacular. But this gives you an idea of the Aristeas. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And notice all of these have been coming from sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, Borneo, New Zealand, Tasmania. At one time, the irises, they thought, originated in Antarctica. And Antarctica at that time was a temperate climate, the earth moved around a bit, so that it was connected to South Africa, Australia, and South America, the tips of those countries. So that's why you get this distribution. And that's where irises started, but then they worked their way up the different continents in different ways. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Um, these are some pictures of Aristea, one of the more showy ones in the garden. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, the last really strange group or subfamily is the Navinoideae. And these are the tree irises. They're woody. They get large enough, according to Peter Goldblatt, he mentions in his book that a small child could climb in them. Although I couldn't find any pictures of anything that looked like it was over 4 foot. So they're not very big trees, but they are sturdy enough and have enough woody substance that they can hold a small child. Next picture. These are some examples of what they look like in the wild. And they really can be very attractive, although they have lots of flowers, but the flowers only last a very short time. So it's not like they're covered. Sometimes they can be covered with flowers, but the effect's not going to be lasting that long. But it does last long enough because there are lots of flowers. Okay, next slide. Cladia is one of this group, and its flowers are quite different, and they're tubular, and they're pollinated by birds. So this is one of the bird pollinated groups, and you'll find that over and over in the Iris family, lots of genera have a few bird pollinated species, even though the rest of the species in the genera are not. So let's go to the next slide. Now, this is one of the big families of subfamilies, the Crocoideae. We all know crocus. And if you think about it, these are all sort of crocus-like, more or less, but there's some that look a little bit more like gladiolus, which is also in this group. So I'm not sure how you could generalize to sort of pick them out, but there's over 1,000 species, and we're going to go through a few tribes. Some of these I have never seen myself, so like Tritonopsis. Let's go to the next slide. I found these pictures on the internet. I thought they were really interesting. This is what the Triptoniopsis is like. And you can see there's quite a bit of variation. The very strong tubular flowers are undoubtedly sunbird pollinated in Africa. A lot of these groups come from South Africa. And South Africa is a big area for speciation in the Iridaceae. And Iridaceae make up a huge part of its flora. It has what's called a Mediterranean climate. And Andy lives in a Mediterranean climate. So he can grow any of these things that I'm talking about, but most of us don't. If you happen to live around the Mediterranean, you live in a Mediterranean climate, most likely. Mediterranean climates are characterized by a wet winter and a dry summer. So, I don't know when you get any rain in the summer, Andy, but you do get rain in the winter, and that's when most of these things grow. And so they can tolerate a lot less rain because it's cool generally in the winter. And so they grow very nicely in the winter and then sort of disappear mostly in the summer. Next slide. Now, the Watsonii are an interesting tribe. They have a variety of different types of flowers, and you can see they're larger plants generally, although some of them can be quite small. And these are some of the genera in the Watsoniae. I'm going to show you individually quite a few of them. Most of you, if you're familiar with anything in this group, would be Watsonia. And Watsonia bourbonica is the most common one in cultivation. And that's on the right. And I'll have another picture of it in a few minutes. So there's 8 genera and 11, excuse me, 111 species. But remember, these are constantly changing. And a lot of these genera wind up getting combined and others separated into different genera depending upon the authority that's looking at them. So let's go to the next slide. Obviously, these are two that are not particularly garden exciting plants. Zygotritonia. If you look at the plant on the left, the flowers are very tiny. They're interesting flowers. It's sort of like if they were large, I would expect they would be bird pollinated, but they're probably pollinated by some fly that has a fairly long snout. The Savannosiphon is not particularly exciting either, with the flowers being bent over for most of the time, but it might be something somebody might want to grow. But these are the two unusual genera at the beginning of this tribe. Let's go to the next slide. Laperousea, or let's see, Laperousea. Okay, it has 42 species. They're mostly tropical and really brightly colored. And they have very different styles of flowers. Like on the right, the purple one is almost radially symmetrical. And the one on the left is bilaterally symmetrical. So the bilateral symmetry probably indicates that there's a particular pollinator that it's trying to attract and designed to be most optimal at getting the pollen or the nectar. Or a lot of irises have oil glands too that the pollinators go for. So, and then other types of pollinators would probably pollinate the cushion kabong that you see on the left. But to me, they're all really pretty flowers and pretty interesting plants. Then they'd be great for growing in an alpine house or a greenhouse, cold greenhouse. But I'm not sure most of us could grow them outside, unfortunately. Let's go to the next slide. Watsonia is a group of larger flowered plants in the Watsoniaceae. And you can see the diversity here from the literature of many of the different types. I'll just point out the Bourbonica because it's what is most commonly grown, but there's a lot of others that would make really pretty garden plants. Okay, let's try the next slide. This is a Bourbonica in person. You can see they tend to be growing in the higher mountainous areas of South Africa. So they actually do get some cold. And sometimes these things surprise you and can actually be grown in zone 8 or zone 7 outside with a little protection. So it's not out of reach of most gardeners. Let's go to the next slide. The gladioli. Now I get really excited about the gladioli. Melisferulia, melasferula. We'll get it one of these days. Has really tiny flowers, so it's not really, it's more like a baby's breath type thing if you want it for the garden. And the other genus in the tribe is the gladiolus, which by the way I've never heard it pronounced gladiolus, which would be the third um, syllable from the end. So um, I'm not sure how that applies really on the pronunciation. I used to remember Flower and Garden magazine used to have a section where they had pronunciation, and they would show two different types of pronunciation. One was for Americans and one was for uh, everybody else that really wanted the Latin. So remember, you're not doing something terrible if you mispronounce it. Let's go to the next slide. The gladiolus have 200, well, around 290 species. So there's really a lot of different types of gladiolus. And when I think of the modern cultivated gladiolus, in a lot of ways, they seem a lot less interesting than these types of gladiolus that have the bilaterally symmetrical flowers and probably are designed more for bird pollination than they are designed for a lot of other things. So just, and by the way, gladiolus, as I said before, a lot of these things come from higher elevations. I can grow gladiolus outside in zone 7. I'm a 7A. They don't always bloom, but they do live. And if I gave them better care and more sun, I'm sure they probably would. I have had them bloom consecutively for a long time sometimes. So unfortunately, my garden's getting too shaded, and so they do less well. But surprisingly, most of the gladiolus have some hardiness. How far you can go is probably a question, but it's worth trying. Let's go to the next slide. Obviously, there are lots of these. Some of them don't really look like much at all, like Gladiolus abbreviatus. Um, but Gladiolus equitans to me is a real intriguing looking plant. And some of them are quite tiny, but other ones are quite large. So there's quite a variety. Gladiolus communis is one that grows in Italy, around the Mediterranean, and it's hardy. It's hardier in zone 5 even. So let's go to the next slide. It has a number of close relatives that I'll mention in a minute. This was Gladio. It's interesting. The PowerPoint is sort of those, well, anyway, they're all examples. These are all Gladiolus carneus. And you can see the live picture, but they vary considerably in the wild. And a lot of times people say, well, one of the rules somebody used to say in SIGNA was that the plants reproduce themselves exactly, then they're obviously the same, they're a species. But that's really not true. I mean, there's so much variation that some of these things look like totally different species and sometimes have been named different species. And then looking at them more closely, they realize that they really are a single species with just a lot of variation. Let's go to the next slide. As I say, I like the bird pollinated look. And let's see, you can't read this, but I'm trying to remember the name, and I can't at the moment. But anyway, this is a really neat looking gladiolus. I like it. Let's try the next slide. Gladiolus italicus and communis and byzantinus are all names that have been given to some fairly similar plants. In the Mediterranean area, they're called the corn flags because they grow wild in cornfields, and they're sort of a pest for the people growing corn because when they plow the fields, it divides the bulbs and they have even more. So they keep getting more and more corn iris and corn gladiolus and but they are nicely hardy and they're worth trying even in a zone 5 garden. I used to grow them in Missouri, so there are gladiolus available to you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. These are just some more different types of gladiolus. And trying to see if the one, no, I don't see the name. Let's go to the next slide. This is the X name for gladiolus that's a hybrid, Gladiolus X gandavensis. And this is probably what most of the hybrid gladiolus would have as their scientific name. Although there's some other X names that were different species that were combined. And so some of them might be a different name, but this is probably the largest majority of what the garden gladiolus that you know are named. Let's go to the next slide. And one that everybody knows as Acidanthera is now called Gladiolus murielii. Murielii. Anyway, it blooms late in the fall, and it takes it all summer to get going, but it finally blooms just before frost. So you grow it fairly easily, and then you can lift it and bring it in, which is one of the things you have to do with a lot of these plants sometimes, if they're not real hardy in your area. A sure way of keeping them. Let's go to the next slide, and it's easily available. The freesias are pretty much florist plants. You'll find them, I actually have seen them in Home Depot in pots blooming, and most of them look like the one on the right, which is Freesia lectlinii. And it is one of the parents of the hybrids that are growing, that are usually grown by the florist, and they come in all different colors. So, but they look generally like that. And one of the characteristics, which it probably doesn't show in the other two as well, is that the flower cyme sort of bends over and lays out like the one on the right in most of them. So that's sort of characteristic of the freesias. And you can see the funny looking stigmas on the center one. You can see how they stick up and are quite different than a lot of the other irises. So this is freesia. The freesia genera are Crocosmia, Devia, freesia, and Xenocapa. And let's go to the next slide. These are just freesias here. Another freesia that for a long time was not recognized as a freesia. It started out being recognized as a Laperoussia, and then they changed their mind. And most recently, I have gotten it under the name Anemotheca. But it's a little tiny flower. Well, according to some of the pictures, some of them can get probably an inch in size for the flowers, but they're really easy to grow and they come up from seed really easily. So if you have any trouble growing these, even in a zone 7, they'll come up from seeds and bloom. So it's a fun iris. Okay, next slide. Now, the Crocosmias, I think, is a pretty neat plant for gardens. They originally they were called Montbretias or Montbretias. And you can see on the right is Crocosmia pottsii, and on the left is Crocosmia aurea. And Lemion, the French hybridizer, hybridized those two plants, which don't look like they're not quite really alike, and got the plant in the middle, which is Crocosmia flora. And that is probably what most of the varieties are today that you see in gardens is Crocosmia flora. You can still get Crocosmia aurea and Crocosmia pottsii, and there's 6 species total in the group, but the number of cultivars is now around 400. So Next slide. You can see in the garden, this gives you some idea of what they look like. There's quite a bit of variation. Some of them are probably almost 5 feet tall, and some of them are only a few inches tall. So you can get all different sizes. Next slide. And this is probably my favorite because it's hardy here really easily, is Lucifer. It's a Crocosmia flora. It was produced by Bressingham Gardens in the 1970s, I believe. And it was, again, a cross between the other two. And this is what they got. And it's a super plant. It gets about 4 feet tall. This is in my garden, and on the left, the plant was just one bulb that I planted in the spring, and it came up and did that in the matter of a summer. So, and that was by July actually. So, and it would have kept blooming, except we got a drought, and it stopped blooming probably about August. But it bloomed for a good month, and it would have bloomed longer if we would have had better rain. But unfortunately, we didn't have rain, and we had puppies, and I was taking care of them and didn't get a chance to water the garden the way I should. So anyway, next slide. Now, the crocus genera, most of them you can think of as being very crocus-like, and Romula on the left and Geiseriza are pretty much crocus-like. Diorema is an interesting plant. If you look at the picture, it shows this plant with this huge wand going up, and they can get like 6 feet tall. And they grow near streams generally, and in South Africa, and the bells hang down, and sometimes they're called fairy bells, but it's a plant that you see in a lot of British gardens, and I always lust for, but I've tried several times, and there are some dwarf ones that I thought maybe I could do that, but they didn't make it through the winter, so too bad. Chesmanthe is another one of the genera in the Crocosmias, Crocosea, the tribe Crocosea. All the tribes end in OCEA, EAE. I can't talk today. Okay, next slide. Now, just to give you an idea of some of the Romulas, they would be great alpine garden plants for in a alpine house or a cold greenhouse. I don't think many of these will make it in outside, except in a Mediterranean climate. And Romula does extend around the Mediterranean, the Canarian Islands, Arabian Peninsula, and Socotra, which is an island. So it has a fairly broad range, and there probably are species that you could grow if you kept trying in a lot of different climates, and maybe even here. Let's try the next slide. But they are pretty. This, I think, is like a showstopper. The white ring wine cups, Geiseriza. It's Geiseriza. Geiseriza. Anyway, they're, again, small crocus-like flowers. And if you think about the crocus, can you ever remember a red crocus? I can't. There's only blue and yellow and white and different combinations, maybe pinkish. But Geiseriza and Romulia have some really red flowered plants. Next slide. Now, just to give an idea of what exists, there's 2 species that are in the genus Ridinosyphon, and 7 species in Syringodia. But they're pretty much, as you can see the syringodia is really small because you can see the fingers to the side behind the plant that's being held, how small the plant is. So the whole thing is a tiny, tiny little plant. So if you wanted to grow them, they are pretty and they'd be nice in an alpine house, but I'm not sure they might get lost in a rock garden if they were hardy, which I don't think they are. They're tropical Africa. So let's go to the next slide. Um, Hesperantha is, let's do it again. Hesperantha, technically it would be Hesper means evening and antha means flower. So that's why I want to say Hesperantha. But again, the rule of the third syllable is Hesperantha. So anyway, that's why I keep having problems is I read these things, but I don't speak them. They have a lot of fairly attractive plants, but the different Hesperanthas are not especially great, except for the last one that was actually put in a different genus for a long time. It was called Schizostylus, or Schizostylus, as I would say. Next slide. I grew this some time back and I didn't read up on it really well. All I knew was it was a red flowered irid and I wanted to grow it. And I got a plant of it and it did absolutely nothing. And I thought, oh God, and it was going into the drought we have in midsummer and doing really badly. And I thought I'm going to lose it. And I put it in a pot that was sitting in another pot that didn't have a hole in it and it filled up with water. And it turns out after it started growing really rapidly. And I thought, what's going on here? You know, it should be suffocating in the water. And after looking up a little bit of information, it grows on the banks of rivers or in the edge of the river. So most of the time it's flooded anyway in nature. And it's only during the dry spells that it really dries out. This was a very popular plant, Schizostylus, and you'll still see it under that name in the books because it blooms really late in the fall. When I say late, I mean late. It really starts forming its inflorescence about November, and you have flowers. In England, what they did was they grew it in the garden, then dug it up right before it was going to bloom because it would be getting too cold and bring it in and they'd have flowers in December. So you could have flowers all December long, which was sort of neat. And it's a really pretty flower, really glossy petals and so forth. So I decided I'm going to try and see if I can find other varieties of this and go to the next slide. And I found white ones and pink ones. And I contacted the curator of the National Collection of Schizostylus in England. And he told me there were about 50 different forms or varieties. And I had, these are three here, and the one on the right is a little bit more dusky red than the one I showed you before. The one in the middle is a really pretty pink, and there's another form that has a little bit bigger flowers that is called Big Mama, and that's the one I would say is the really neatest one of them all. But in growing these, I got them sort of late in the fall, and it was a little too late for them to develop enough to really grow. So I brought them in under lights. And I found out that they will grow under lights and bloom all winter long. And not only did they bloom all winter long, they bloomed all the way till June when I brought them outside. So it was a really neat plant. And nowhere in the literature does anybody say anything about them blooming in the spring or winter. It's all a matter of, you know, this is a late fall blooming plant that you dig up and, you know, have it bloom inside for Christmas. So I thought I sort of like the schizostylus. It gets its name. I used to call it schizostylus all the time because the style arms, if you look at the picture, are split, and there are three split style arms going really large style arms that are filaments in different directions. Schizo means, of course, split. So the name schizostylus to me has more meaning than schizostylus. But anyway, I'm beating a dead horse. Let's go. Next slide. Crocus. Everybody knows crocus. And if you're not growing crocus, shame on you. It's a really nice early spring plant, easy to acquire, easy to get. But how many of you know that there are fall blooming crocuses? And half of all the crocuses are fall blooming crocuses. And the most important crocus financially in the world is, don't all say it together, saffron.
Mm.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. That's just a regular crocus. Let's go to, and there are tons of species. This is the wild saffron crocus. Saffron crocus is really easy to grow. I grew it in St. Louis, zone 5. I grew it under trees where the moisture was sucked dry from the roots of the trees all summer. And then in the fall, when they lose their leaves, the moisture would come back into the ground and the saffrons would bloom. And they're really easy to grow. The cultivated saffron is a triploid, so it's sterile. And the wild species that it comes from is Crocus cartwrightianus. So Crocus cart, God, I can't talk today. Cartwrightianus. All the pictures to the side, to the left, and above are the wild species, and the one below is the cultivated one. And I say one, it's not really true. You would think because they're sterile, there wouldn't be any variety in the colors, but you can find white ones and various shades of lavender and pink and purple because of mutations that what we call sports that have been selected for that just happened to occur, but they didn't occur sexually. So just spontaneously. And people saved them and multiplied them. So there's a lot of different colors of Crocus sativus, which is the cultivated crocus saffron. And I don't know if all of you realize that saffron is just the stigmas.
Mm.
So those red stigmas, somebody goes and collects those, and that's what makes up saffron. And that's why it's so hugely expensive, because I have no idea how many millions of style arms it would take to make up a pound of saffron. But fortunately, you don't have to use a pound to get the flavor. Okay, next slide. But in the Iris family, that's probably the most important plant commercially. Now, Babiana is an interesting South African plant, lots of different variation. I don't know. Can anybody see my mouse moving around, my cursor? I can't. Okay, it's just on my screen. Unfortunately, in the trying to pick out one. Some of these, the one in the middle at the top, Babiana ringens, appears to be something that would be close to a bird pollinated flower, and obviously has a completely different structure than some of the radially symmetrical flowers. Radially symmetrical flowers are called actinomorphic, and I mentioned that the bilateral symmetrical flowers are called zygomorphic. So you'll hear those terms a lot. But in each group of each genera of these irises, there are plants with actinomorphic flowers and there are plants with zygomorphic flowers. just because the pollinators in for that particular species have developed the plants into something quite different. These are cute little plants. Babiana is usually recognized by the fact that its leaves are really deeply pleated. And you can sort of see that on all of these pictures. Let's go to the next slide. And they are available. I've seen Babiana offered for sale. And remember the Geiseriza, the white-ringed Geiseriza. Look at the Babiana. It's called white cup baboon root. It has the same coloration almost as the Geiseriza. So they almost like convergent evolution of what they can do. The Babiana, some of them are quite tiny, others are larger, but there are varieties that have been developed that are hybrids also. So quite a pretty group of plants, but probably not particularly feasible unless you have a cold greenhouse. Next slide. Sparaxis, again, are another group similar to the Babianas, and usually the bulb firms that offer Babianas also offer Sparaxis. But notice Sparaxis variegata up in the left, the blue, is very much different from Sparaxis grandiflora that has the actinomorphic flowers. And I believe it's Sparaxis villosa on the right. It's covered up by unfortunately, the screen is not saving exactly the same as what I see when I created this, but that's more like what the cultivated plants look like for the most part. Okay, next slide. Here's some live shots of Sparaxis. And look at the really weird cluster of stamens and pistil from the enlargement down below, or even in the one above. That seems very different. I'm not sure that's consistent for all Sparaxis, but it's very different, very unusual. Let's go to the next slide. Tritonias. Okay, another group. Remember, we only have 1,000 species to go through in the crocation. But I'm not going to show you all of them, unfortunately. But here's Tritonia, and we'll go on to another group. Tritonias are also generally somewhat available commercially. Okay, next slide. And the Exias is another group you'll find commercially also. And this gives you a fairly good idea of what Exias look like. Okay, let's go on. Now we're going to get to the irises, the real irises. And most people call a lot of these things irises. But these are the tribes. There are 5 tribes in the iris family, in the iris subfamily. And just gives you a general idea. I'll go through each one. So let's go to the next slide. Now, I said at the beginning that all irises have 2 stamens. This is the one exception. Diplerina, 3 stamens. This one has 2. And the 3rd stamen is made into a nectary. So it's not a stamen really at all. So this is a real oddball. And it's sort of a pretty flower and sort of interesting. And it's endemic to Tasmania. Again, one of those primitive areas where the iris began. But it's probably derived more from some primitive plant more than being totally primitive because of its nectary, one stamen being a nectary. So in a trivia question, what would be the one iris that has 2 stamens? It would be Diplerina. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Bobardias. This just gives you a general idea of them. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, dietes is something that Andy probably sees a lot growing in Southern California. Notice the one on the left. See the man standing next to it? This is Dietes robinsoniana. And the picture in the middle is its flower. It's called a wedding iris, wedding flower plant. And it comes from one island in the South Pacific that's right in the middle of the large ocean between New Zealand and Australia, which is weird because it just comes from this one island, the Dietes robinsonia, when there's only about 5 other Dietes, but they all come from the middle of South Africa or northern South Africa in the tropical rainforests. So how in the heck did it get to Lord Howe Island when everything else was somewhere else? Let's go to the next slide. In person, they really look pretty. Andy can attest to that. And I've seen pictures, I think it's been like 30 years ago, of cultivars that were crosses. Andy, do you see any that are?
All the time, yes.
Yeah, I would love to get pictures and names for the different crosses of these dietes, just because it would be nice to know about them. And there really is no source on the internet that I can find for pictures of the different hybrids. So these are 2 of the species. And they do vary somewhat. Next slide. This is a really weird one. This plant is sort of ugly, but it's beautiful. And in the pictures here, it looks sort of ugly, but let's go. Well, let me see if I want to show you anything here. It comes from a corm. It is available every now and then from bulb dealers. And let's go to the next slide.
Wow.
When you look at it close up, the flowers are really sort of exotic and interesting. This is just one of the species. There's only about, well, let's go to the next slide. Maybe I have the number there. I probably don't, but there's probably, I'm thinking around 12 or so species at the most. But look at the flowers close up. They're really intriguing to me. And these are all part of the iris family. It's just interesting to try to figure out what type of pollinator would go after this. And usually on brown colored flowers and sort of ugly flowers, it's carrion flies and beetles that feed off of dung. So they probably don't smell good. But let's go to the next slide. I was really enthralled with these. But to me, that's as exotic as any orchid could be. Well, enough, I guess, of the Ferrarias. Let's go to the next slide. The Moraeas is another group I really like. And Moraeas have lots of times been called irises because a lot of them look so much like an iris. If you look at the second one from the right at the top, Moraea racemosa, notice the large style arms sticking up, just like an iris. The standards are drooping down with the falls, but even so, there's not you think of iris, and I always think of iris as being so unusual in their style arms, but Moraea does the same thing. And for quite often Moraea, when they first were discovered, different plants were named Iris. So that a lot of their former names were Iris names, and people find these plants under the name Iris quite often. But how do you distinguish them from an iris? Well, there's two features that are really sort of different and easy. Every one of them comes from a corm, like a crocus. There's no iris that produce corms. They produce bulbs, but a corm is an entirely different structure. It's a enlarged stem, whereas a bulb is an enlarged bud that contains flower, leaves, and all sorts of things, but not just a large enlarged stem. The other trait that's sort of weird that fascinates me is a lot of them have only a single leaf to each corm. If you look at these pictures, or they have just a minimal number of leaves. And the leaves in cross section, if you look at racemosa again, you get a better idea. They're U-shaped, not like the sword-like leaves of an iris. So U-shaped leaves, minimal leaves, and corms is what distinguishes the Moraeas. And there are quite a few Moraeas. Let's go to the next slide. I don't think I put down the number, but it's something like 160 or something different species of Moraeas. Now the question? The blue one on the right has a feature that I'm going to show you in a couple more, but that blue area is really black. And the blue is an iridescence, like a hummingbird. So our peacock feather. If you look at a peacock feather, it's really black, but when the light hits it and strikes it a certain way, it has all these wonderful colors. And, you know, amazingly, the iris family has iridescence. If you think about it, iridescence, iris, iridaceae. Anyway, to me, it amazes me that we don't do more with iridescence in iris for hybridizing, because there are some irises that show a little bit of this iridescence if you're really looking for it. And I'm sure it could be bred into iris cultivars. And can you imagine irises being blown in the breeze and flashing these iridescent signals and colors? It could be really extraordinary. Let's go to the next slide. Not all of the Moraeas have the iridescence, some do, but there's a lot of different forms, and they look a lot like irises for the most part. I'll let you look around a little bit at these. Ramosissima, is a fairly easily grown one because it will take more water than a lot of them, and a lot of them need the drying off period. They can be grown in a greenhouse or in a pot. I've grown some and managed to get them to bloom, and then managed to kill them. But nonetheless, I've still grown them, so it's possible. Next slide. Now there's one Moraea that's sort of different from all the others, and it's been tossed around a whole lot. It used to be called by the genus Gynandrous Cicericium, and now it's been changed to a Moraea. And it grows in the Mediterranean basin, all around the Mediterranean Ocean. So all the different countries, Italy, Israel, Egypt, have Gynandrous. And it's another jawbreaker. I'm sort of glad they changed it to Moraea. It's much easier to say than Gynandrous, or Gynandrous. Anyway, but this one you'll see listed in a lot of books still as Gynandrous, but it's now concluded in the Moraeas. That's how we get rid of some of these genera, is by including them in other genera. Let's go to the next slide. More of the Moraeas. And again, you see more of the iridescence. I just love how that can be so flashy. And the one of them that I grew had it, and it was just, I just loved it. Okay, next slide. Imagine more. They don't all have blue inflorescence either. Some of them are green. Oh, and you wonder, why would you have this iridescence? It's because these irises are pollinated by mating beetles. The beetles themselves have iridescent backs,
Mm-hmm.
and when they get the pollen on them, they get sprinkled with yellow. So the beetle looks half yellow and half iridescent. And so it thinks when it's flying to another flower that it's flying to another beetle and wants to mate with it. And that's how it winds up pollinating the flower. So these are beetle pollinated flowers. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, the Sisyrinchiae are a group, and they're pretty much North American to a large degree, and South American. There's a few species that occur in Australia, but this group is something that probably a lot of people can grow, some of them anyway. Libertia is not really spectacular. I'm not going to go into that, but it's okay. Let's go to the next slide. Ulcinium is a Pacific Northwest plant, a grass widow. And obviously, if you can grow it in the Pacific Northwest, you should be able to grow it in probably zone 7 or 8 in most of the country. But it's a fairly attractive plant. It also has relatives, other Aciniums that grow in Chile, in the Andes. Okay, let's go to the next one. Arthrosanthus. Arthrosanthus. I did grow it, and actually the horrible pictures that you see are ones from my plants, and they were growing on my deck. And I thought it gave an idea of the size a little bit, so you can understand what they look like. But the other pictures are much better. And they're all fairly similar. Let's go to the next slide. Sisyrinchium is another similar plant, but lots of Sisyrinchiums are hardy. And actually, there's some probably that grow as far north as Canada, but it depends upon the species. Some of the larger flowered ones are a little less hardy, but I grew a number of them that were native to Missouri and in the native prairies. Blue-eyed grass is what they're called. And it's this grass-like plant with these little blue flowers. And the individual flowers on some of them look just like Japanese irises in miniature. So it's like this little tiny version of a Japanese iris. Some plants would actually be only like 4 inches tall with just this cluster of blue flowers over the top. The one on the left is probably, well, I'd say 1.5 to 2 feet tall. And the one down at the bottom that has just covered with flowers is a named variety. So there are named varieties. There's cultivars that are chosen out of the different variation of the individual species. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, if I haven't lost everybody, Sisyrinchium also has the largest in the group is Sisyrinchium striatum to the left, and it grows about 2.5 feet tall. It's not really hardy. It grows in Britain in a lot of places. So if you have plants that grow as well that come from Britain, you probably could grow this. It doesn't come from Britain, but it grows there fairly well. And one of the neat things about it is there is a cultivar with variegated leaves that just is spectacular. And I think it's called Ida May, but I can't, my memory fails me as being sure about that. Let's get the next slide. Okay, we're getting near the end. The tribe Tramisia is pretty much a group of American, South American, Central American, and a little bit of um, Southern North America. Trimesia and Pseudotrimesia and Neomarica and Pseudo-Iris are all sometimes combined in the genus Trimesia. So depending upon the author, you're going to see different ones. Trimesia martinicensis is one that's grown in the islands just off the coast of Florida. So it's probably more grown than most of them. But this is a group that's not as well known to most people. Let's go to the next slide. Almost everything in the group has strangely bent or folded if you want to call them standards. But these are really bizarre how they're folded over. And that's pretty much common within the group. But I think these are really exotic looking plants. Unfortunately, most of the Trimesias are not available, but let's go to the next group. And Neomaricas are actually now all put in Trimesia. So they're all now Trimesias, but I left them separated because these are called the walking irises. And the flower, after it blooms, it bends over and the stem bends down to the ground and forms a new plant. So, they sort of walk and create this colony of plants. And the way Neomarica was distinguished from Trimesia originally was Neomarica had all the stems or these leafy stems. They weren't a nice round circular stem, whereas on the Trimesia, they don't have this leafy nature to the stem. Let's go to some of them in person. And that gives you an idea. They're very pretty plants, I think. Very nice evergreen glossy leaves. But of course, for most of us, they would be a house plant. So go to the next slide. We're almost getting done. I just thought I'd throw this one in as an extra one. And we're coming to our end. We next slide. The last group is the group Tigridia. And by the way, the group before this had Iris in it, but I've skipped over Iris because you all know Iris. And the Tigridia have all these genera. None of them are really important genera exactly, except probably Cypella, which looks a lot like the Trimesias, and Tigridia, which has 55 species. But they're interesting individually. So let's go through real quick. Take a look. Alophia. Rodney Barton grows this down in Texas. It's a native to that area. Calidorea is a plant that will grow in, not this species, but another species. Plant Delights offers it, and it grows in bogs. So you can grow it with your pitcher plants. If you can grow pitcher plants outside, which probably a lot of people can and they don't realize it, you can grow Calidorea too. Let's go to the next slide. You can see all different types of unusual flowers. Cypura is tiny. That the plant that I'm looking at is probably less than 4 inches tall, maybe even 2 inches tall. So it's almost like what's the little lily, the lily of the valley type plant. If you were growing it, notice the oxalis growing next to the one in the picture, the white one, gives you an idea of size. So it's interesting close up, but I'm not sure most people will want to grow it in their gardens. Next slide. Cypella again has the strangely folded tepals, upper tepals. But they are pretty and they are larger. And some of the cypellas can be grown. I can grow 2 or 3 species outside here in Zone 7. So it's possible for a lot of people to grow these. Next slide. Plant Delight's nursery is a good source. And I can't tell you individually whether any of these that are on this page are hardy enough to grow outside, but they may be. Probably people need to try them. Next slide. Okay. Eleutherini. I did it. It's again a fairly small plant, not particularly striking, but at least it gives you an idea. There's only a few species, so it gives you another idea of the rest of the family. Let's go to the next one. Eneolophus. It has a really strange looking center of the stigma and stamens, which is enlarged in the picture. But you can sort of see in the pictures that are there, not a really big plant, not big flower, but just a weird looking thing. Next one, sort of like orchids. Galassini. I grew this. The flowers are fairly short-lived. They only last a few hours in the morning. But they have sort of this cup-shaped, which in this group, a lot of the flowers, petals, the tepals form sort of a cup, and the pollinators go into the cup. So let's go to the next one. Herbertia. Again, it's forming a cup in a way. You can see on the picture. The picture is an enlargement of the picture below. So if you notice how it's greatly enlarged, gives you a different idea of the flower. They're about 6 inches tall, and some of them are fairly hardy, can be grown outside here. Next slide. Hesperoziphion. Hesperoziphion. So it'd be the evening flag, or fairly attractive, quite similar to a lot of the others. I'm not sure we need to go into that very much. I'm not sure how hardy it is. I don't think it's been tried. Probably not available. Let's go to the next one. Laurentia. If you look at the line drawing, it's obviously not a very spectacular plant, but it's sort of cute. So you can see some idea of that genus. Next, Mastigostyla. I don't think anybody has this as far as plants and cultivation, but it's a fairly big group of species. So I guess someday there'll be more. Let's go to the next slide. There's a few more. And they're not huge plants. Some of them are larger than others, but they're not spectacular for the most part, but they are interesting. Okay, next slide. Nemastalis, I like this one a lot because I've grown it, and it grows in the prairies and in North America. So it probably would grow up into North Dakota, South Dakota. So here's an irid that probably almost everybody can grow. It's about foot tall, maybe 1.5 feet. So let's go to Nemastalis. I have to get in the right pronunciation so I don't ruin you all. And the last genus, with 55 species, is Tigridia. And I find this a really exotic plant. It has all sorts of different flowers, as you can see. Pavonia is the one that's in cultivation and has a lot of different colorings. I'll show you a few. Next slide. These are some of the different Tigridias. A lot of the others besides Pavonia has a flower that's a good 6 inches sometimes across. So it can be a fairly large flower. Some of these others, like Durangensis, the other one below it, they're probably 2 or 3 inches. And let's go to the next slide. And some of the ones like this purple one, Piercii, it's probably less than an inch, and the flowers hang down. So like the one down below, also Helbergii, that has the fingers around it. They're holding it up because, as you can see on the plant, they sort of droop. So individually, they're interesting close up, but they're not particularly spectacular in the garden. But the Pavonia is to the lower left is still gorgeous. And to the next slide. Some are quite different altogether, like Tigridia arthantha. So it has its tepals reversed back. But let's go to the next slide. That's it. That finishes the Iris family. I think I got it. I don't know how fast it took to get through, but we did
Thank
it.
you, Bob.
One of the
A couple questions.
one of the reasons why I had the slide up before that you just left, I wanted to point out that on the wiki, there's an area for irids, and almost all of, well, let's put it this way, all the scientific names are there under the irids, and you can look up any group you want. I don't have pictures for all of them. I'm getting pictures. I'm hoping that everybody will help me out. I don't have pages for all of the cultivars, but I'm trying to add those. So if you have pictures of cultivars of these different species, I'd really love you to send me a note and the fact that you'd like to put up a picture, and I'll create a page and put it up. It's amazing. I don't have any pictures of crocus. I'm sure lots of you could provide pictures of crocus, but maybe Andy could provide some pictures of Dietes cultivars. And the important part of this is nowhere on the internet is there a place where we have something like for iris, that we have iris, we have the iris wiki, okay? It's unique in that it has both species and it also has cultivars, and it's complete in its biodiversity. Okay, there's no other place on the internet where we have the biodiversity of the iris family. So I'd like to create that more so in the wiki so that people have a home for finding out the different colorations and patterns and looks of different crocus and gladiolus and all these different iris family genera. And all the genera are there right now, but we don't have all the cultivars. So if you can help me out on that, I'd really appreciate it. The second thing was on the last page, I don't know if you can retrieve it or not, but I wanted to thank iNaturalist, because that's where I got a lot of the pictures from. And they're a website for just really wild species of plants and animals. There's, I think, 4 or 5 main sources of seed for irids. There's SIGNA, of course, our section of the Iris Society. There's the Pacific Bulb Society, which has a nice wiki type thing also, but they don't go into cultivars very much. There's the North American Rock Garden Society. It has a seed exchange, the Scottish Rock Garden Society, and the British Iris Society. So all of these are sources of seeds. If you Google any of the particular genera, you might find nurseries that are offering 1 or 2 genera. So it's not impossible to find. And I hope you have a good time growing these plants. Take any questions.
Okay, Bob, going back a little bit, you had a photo of Tritonia growing in clay pots. Do you water them all year, and is there a period of dormancy?
Okay, almost all of the iris. This is one of the things about families, understanding a family is almost all families have certain characteristics that are general throughout the family. Uh, most iris require a dry period or a rest period. Like just think of iris in the summer, they go dormant, sort of. So all of these plants, well, I'll say all of them have some dormant period during the year. Some it's critical that they have the dormant period, and that it be a really hard, terrible dormant period where they really dry out, which is why some of these are grown in alpine houses, because if they don't have that dry period, they'll rot during the summer. But in the cool weather, almost all of them tend to grow. So that's pretty much true of everything in the iris family. Uh, all the different types of bulbs, generally bulbous plants, have a dry period that they go through. That's why they have the bulb. Uh, the one of the plants, remember Schizostylus, the really red Hesperanthus type plant that I said grows in water. It's one of the few that doesn't, of the Hesperanthes, that doesn't have a bulb, doesn't have a corm, because growing in water, it's adapted to just having roots, and lost its bulbs or its corms. So anyway, these characteristics are typical, and I would say always try to, when they start to go dormant, give them a rest period, and then you can start when the weather cools again and get them growing again.